This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're talking to anthropologist Ben Chang. He's going to be telling us all about the recent clashes in Guatemala between a indigenous resistance movement and a company that is trying to dig out the nickel ore in their region. The police moved in, blasted everybody with tear gas because the indigenous people set up a roadblock. It's very interesting. It goes quite deep and it involves corruption, the government, indigenous people being murdered, and Russian companies. Very interesting. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front and you want more, go to patreon.com/popularfront. So there's this situation in Guatemala where the indigenous people have set up these roadblocks, trying to stop this nickel ore mine going into operation or whatever it is. The police, they've responded, tear gas, gone over the top, everything like that. Explain to us what is going on exactly, because I don't know a lot about this region, and from what I'm hearing, it sounded like things are getting quite nasty over there with this situation with the nickel mine.
Actually, a nickel mine that has been around in the country, since the middle of the last century. Guatemala at that time was going through a very serious civil war. Actually, the civil war here is the reason why genocide is codified in law internationally. It was just really that bad. And, essentially, a lot of the civil war here was basically American interests being defended by military governments that were propped up by American governments, of course, back in the day. And so the thing is, this nickel mine was acquired by Russian interests around 2010, and they basically got the mine back up and running, and they've been exporting nickel basically to Ukraine ever since. And let's say the issue with this mine is that it has basically been violating human rights for its entire existence. Among other things, like one of the things that happened was, like when the mine was being built, they moved a lot of communities from where they were. There is actually a case where several women were mass raped during the operation and the construction of the mine. And this is a case that is still being handled in Canadian courts. So this mine has a long history. There were also some university students that were murdered. I actually personally knew two of them that were murdered close to the mine. And I can't legally say that the mine did it, but they did hire the lawyers that stopped the case going through the courts. And it's still an ongoing case. So the current clashes basically are because the mine was basically suspended by our Supreme Court in 2019 for not doing the Indigenous Peoples consultation that is mandated by the International Labor Organization. What happened was they did do a couple of consultations, but they were basically a farce. They were poorly executed. They did not take into account all of the communities they should have. And a lot of the leaders that approved the mine were basically bought off by the mine. The Supreme Court, which is not exactly anything of a democratic or actually well-run institution in this country, it was to the point where the Supreme Court itself also said, hey, this actually needs to be done. The current clash happened because the mine, despite claiming to have suspended, has still been bringing materials into the mining site. The thing is that they have their own processing plant right next to the mining site, and it is technically owned by a different company, and therefore they do not technically need the same mining license to be active to continue operating. And they do process nickel from other mines in the area, but all of these are owned by the same small group of Russian businessmen, right? And so basically the local Kekchi Maya community that has been blocking the roads to stop the mine from operating tried to stop a truck full of coal from going into the mine because it was needed for the processing plant to operate. The company tried to say, listen, the processing plant and the mine are not the same thing, and therefore you are not allowed to you're not allowed to stop this material from going in. And the people in the community basically did not believe them and did not let the trucks through. After about 2 days of back and forth, what happened was the government just went full into repression mode. What they did was they had hundreds of policemen appear on the scene and start raining tear gas into the local resistance movement. There were children there were elderly people there, and a lot of people were hurt. People who had homes along the highway had to evacuate their homes because there was so much tear gas. And then basically the police started forming phalanxes and marching the trucks into the processing plant. The reason the government was able to justify this is because Guatemala has a very strange system here where we basically are legally allowed to declare a state of siege, which is like a state of emergency, but we can still declare a state of siege in this country. And what it does is it allows use of force. It allows the government to suspend constitutional rights. And it also allows the government to skip the legal protections against excessive and unauthorized spending. So they can declare a state of siege and then, for example, repair military helicopters without going through the normal legal purchasing process. And so basically what happened was they declared a state of siege. And since Congress needs to ratify the state of siege within 3 days, they basically know that they had 3 days to do whatever they wanted. During these 3 days, they raided the homes of a couple of local journalists that were doing most of the reporting, took all of their recording equipment, and briefly arrested one of them. And then, like, a lot of the people that were actually at the resistance that were shot up by the police were also having their homes raided. They had phones, bank cards, even like physical printed copies of the Supreme Court sentencing document, like photocopies taken from their homes. And basically, it's a fear tactic. There were helicopters flying overhead and things like this. And all of this was to get or I believe 2 trucks of coal into the mining.
Right. So that's a lot of that's a lot of information right there. So let's just talk about the clashes for a second. So these were indigenous people, right, that came down to these nickel mines when this situation broke out recently.
Yes. So basically, when you talk about resistance movements in this country, most of them are essentially handled by local indigenous communities whose right to consultation and whose natural resources are being destroyed by these mining companies. And this is basically no exception. So there are something like 160 communities that are claiming that they are not being considered legally for this consultation process, and they are demanding to, at the very least, be heard. And they basically had a roadblock set up outside of the mine. For these 160 communities, what they do is that they send people to basically take turns to man the roadblock. And so at any given time, there are only about 40 people blocking the road. The mining company, their PR people have basically come out to say that the people that are at the roadblock are people that are angry that they didn't get jobs at the mine, and so it's just these 40 people that are starting trouble, which is a lie. They are basically representatives from, like I said, about 160 communities.
Mm. And are these like kind of, what are they, like militia groups, or just like, are they armed militia, paramilitary type groups? Are they just kind of, angry locals, or what?
Yeah, they are just people with machetes. They set up a roadblock. They block the road. They use their machetes basically to cut down trees and block the road. And then they basically set up a camp there to watch and make sure that none of the materials go in. So there's really nothing in terms of like organized militia that you could speak of. This is very grassroots, very local communities trying to have their voices heard and being basically squashed by overwhelming amounts of government force.
Right. So they set up these roadblocks, and the government came in pretty heavy from the images that you showed me. Maybe just go over that again. Like, what was their response to these roadblocks?
So essentially, what happened was on the first day, the lawyer from the community, from the company, came to try to convince people that the processing plant and the mine were not the same thing. So when she showed up, there's actually videos of her showing up, and she's surrounded by a lot of high-ranking police. And when this conversation about whether or not the materials could go in was not fruitful for the company, immediately hundreds of police officers were brought in, as well as members of the Guatemalan army. I believe there were 2 army helicopters flying overhead. There were also hundreds of police officers with riot shields and tear gas canister launchers. And like there are videos that you can find. There's a local news organization called Prensa Comunitaria, which they're basically a loose network of local journalists, and they've been getting most of the information out of the area. They've brought out pictures of like hundreds of police cars lined up along the road. And that's essentially what they did. They brought in overwhelming amounts of human force and air force.
Right. And this, so they've introduced a curfew over this, right? Like the government is taking it obviously really seriously.
I wouldn't know if seriously is the term. Like I said, this issue with the state of siege that the government has like the legal right to set up is how they institute the curfew. But they do this all the time. It is like something that should be very serious, very heavy, very hardcore. And they basically throw it out there every time that they wish to somehow, justify illegal spending or somehow bring to bear large amounts of force to suspend rights. For example, in the context of the pandemic, a state of emergency or a state of siege was declared several times. And we were basically under curfew for a better part of 2020, with the pandemic as a justification. It got to the point where the Congress simply stopped approving these states of siege. So by many people in the populace, this whole idea of a curfew of a state of siege being declared has become somewhat frivolous because it is being used frivolously.
Right. So when you say state of siege, from what I've read, basically they're under martial law, right? For basically saying like, stop mining on our land.
Yes, exactly. They are essentially under martial law. And one thing to note is I believe there is also information that can be read about how there's this huge case going on where the owners of these Russian nickel mines were actually bribing the president, and there's evidence that they've given it the name of the magic carpet case because millions of dollars were wrapped into a carpet and hand delivered to his apartment in one of the more high-end parts of the city. And the source of the money has been traced back to the owners of this nickel mine. And basically in exchange for this government has reactivated a lot of mining efforts. And also they were given a ridiculously good deal for use of port space. It was something like 900 times lower than what legally they were supposed to be paying per square meter. And so the fact that he is using this huge amount of government resources and this martial law declaration to defend this mining project seems to coincidentally have to do with the fact that the mine is owned by the people that bribed him.
Yeah, it just sounds like very, maybe not straightforward, but quite a kind of textbook case of corruption for materials. You know what I mean?
Yes, indeed. And it's basically this is what life is like in Latin America. It's what it's been like since the 60s, basically. It's the same system, the same processes, the same corrupt ideas and the same behaviors from wannabe dictators, essentially.
Right. And what's the government like now in Guatemala? I'm completely in the dark about the situation with the government, other than this situation. Right.
Well, the Guatemalan government is run on a presidential system that was modeled after the American system. We have one president for 4 years, and they have a one-term limit. And of course, we have a Congress. And basically, what has happened over the last 2 years is that ever since in fact, there's an intricate relationship between extractivism and the Guatemalan government, obviously. The first Democratic president after the Civil War ended in 1996 was a president named Alvaro Arzu, and he is actually the one that wrote into law the current mining law and regulation that the companies now use to exploit the resources. And ever since then, basically what has happened is there's been one president promising to be, the non-corrupt outsider that is going to come out and, drain the swamp. And he'll come in and basically be the same corrupt trash as we've always had. And then the person that was in second place from the last election will usually become the next president, promising to drain the swamp, and so on for years on end, basically since 1996 till now. In 2015, there was a huge debacle where one of our president Otto Perez Molina, who actually was a former general and responsible for many genocides committed during the Civil War, became president, and he was basically so up to his neck in grifts and stealing that he and his vice president and many people in his government are either running from the law and or in prison. And essentially, the damage done by that government and everything they stole is still being felt to this day. And the governments that have come since then have also basically been justified with the whole, once again, the drain the swamp narrative that became even stronger because of all the damage this president did. The current president is named Alejandro Yamatei, also very corrupt. He was once the what we call ministro de Ministro de Gobernación, basically the internal ministry, like the one that runs the police and such, for a previous president. And during that time, he actually committed a lot of extrajudicial murders. Like you can go to certain parts of the city and still ask people about, the people that were killed for being remotely dressed as gangsters back in the day. And he was actually in prison for a while for extrajudicial killings in prisons that he ran back when he was in government during one of the previous presidents. And he basically came to the current presidency, under a very, hard fist, tough on crime platform. And he basically immediately began mismanaging the country, mismanaging the pandemic. And now he is basically just using the government as a tool of force to defend extractive industry in the country.
Wow. Okay, that sounds like a very bad situation then. In terms of the kind of relationship then between the state and the indigenous people, has that just kind of flared up because of this nickel mine, or is it kind of an ongoing thing? I imagine it's more the latter, right?
Yeah. Yes. It's actually been a consistent and constant problem that this country has had since the 50s. When basically, well, not since the 50s, it's been a problem for the past 400 years since the colony. In fact, many of the people who are in economic and political power today are still like heirs of the colonial slave state that was essentially imposed by the Spanish when they came over, back when they invaded. So the bad relationship between the indigenous communities and the government has been, the same story of colonialism that you have always heard. More recently, basically what has happened is that extractive industries have come in through, let's say, more democratic means, usually supported by the different embassies of the companies of the countries where these companies come from, and so on. And so the tension between resistance communities against destructive industry and the government is always constant, and these flare-ups happen all the time. It is also important to note that since Guatemala is part of the corridor that the narcotraficantes use to bring the cartel goods and money from South America through to Mexico and up to the north, a good part of the extractive industry is also either a good way for laundering money related to the drug cartels, or in some ways, some of the companies are even set up by drug cartels, and in some cases, even mining licenses have been used to kind of take over certain areas and use them so that they could transport and do certain things without the government really turning an eye on them. So yeah, basically the tension is constant, and these flare-ups happen once or twice a year, all the time.
This one seems to be like a particularly kind of watershed moment, though, almost.
The reason why I would say that is a little bit different than other times is because the country is currently going through a situation where a lot of the companies are being forced to go back and do these consultation processes that they failed to do earlier. So essentially, there is a lot more of a solid local organization, and the indigenous communities are a lot more educated now about their legal rights and their international treaties that the government has signed. And also, I would say another thing is that the post-war generation of the indigenous communities are coming of age. And this means that their philosophy when it comes to interacting with the government and dealing with these sorts of things is much more mature. And so basically, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a watershed moment so much as it is very indicative of the changing times and how indigenous communities are starting to respond to these extractive industries and the problems that they cause in their lands.
Yeah, definitely. So what's next for the indigenous people that are trying to resist this situation with the nickel mine?
Well, as far as I can tell, they have at least the mine has managed at least to get its materials in. So these things will continue. However, this has caused there to be a lot more tension around the consultation process that the mine is obligated to go over before they manage to legally reopen the mine. It is also important to note, I sent you some maps, and I believe that these maps can be published so that people can see them. Basically, the eastern third of the country, essentially different Mayan communities are now starting to interact with each other because all these mining companies, as they have come to the country and caused the problems that they have caused, different Mayan communities around the country have had basically the exact same experience. And so the amount of people that are willing to stand up for the mine has gone down dramatically. And so basically these resistance movements are getting stronger and they're starting to connect with each other a lot better. And that is something very hopeful to look forward to.
Yeah. Do you think that things could get more violent? Because obviously the roadblocks didn't exactly stop things for very long. If you look at any of the photos they sent in, armored vehicles and stuff like that, the government did. Do you think that maybe, the indigenous people might have to kind of step it up a level, if you like? I mean, it's not ideal, but, violence is violence.
Yes, I understand. One thing I will say is that, for example, if you look at the way that the Zapatistas operate, or some of those militias are starting to pop up in southern Mexico, I believe that the culture of resistance that they have there is much different than what is had here. There is a much different idea about how you stand up to things and how you fight for them. I do believe that there will be a lot more movement on the legal battle side of things. A lot more cases are going to be coming up to the Supreme Court. And the indigenous communities here understand that any more drastic violent action that they take will result in a negative impact in how they are seen from the city in a very centralized country. And eventually it will negatively impact their ability to fight for their rights in the court system, which is still generally the strategy that is being followed. So I would say probably we're not going to see an escalation of the violence. But what we are going to see is continued incidents and events related to this mining project and a great many other mining projects around the country. And I believe that's what's going to be happening. We're going to see this same relatively small event happening again and again and again over the coming years until things are decided one way or the other.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask about that. There are so many different indigenous communities there in Guatemala. And it's easy to see there are all these mines cropping up all over the place. Do the indigenous people there have some kind of network at least to kind of share information or tactics or whatever it is they're going to do?
There are several groups. The issue is that there has been so much conflict for so long in this country that it is difficult for groups with different interests to necessarily organize and get together and get on the same page. But we are starting to see this happen, in part because of what I told you earlier, how the experiences that these different communities are starting to have with all of these mining companies are starting to look very similar in every case. The tactics are the same. The violence is the same. The lies they're being told by the companies are the same. And so this is starting to foment networks and organization between the different communities. And we are seeing some national level movements, but those are still not quite there. Usually, the best way to go about learning and organizing these resistance movements are small local level organizations that are starting to connect and communicate with each other, sometimes on a municipal or town level.
Right. In terms of this nickel mine specifically in this recent situation, what exactly are the demands of the indigenous people? Obviously, they wanted to stop this going ahead, but now going forward, what are their kind of, their key points? What do they want to do now?
Well, obviously, the large main key point, I would say, is to essentially be heard in this consultation process that they have a legal right to. Like I said, the mine claims that they have done 2 processes before, and they're in the process of the 3rd one. But those 2 first ones were discounted, right? They don't actually count. So, first of all, these communities already see a future where they are not going to be included. And then I do believe that the next step is to understand that there are many people, including members of the new Guatemalan Supreme Court, that have already said that a negative answer on behalf of the indigenous communities with relation to one of these consultations is simply not a veto of the project. So basically, the current demand is to be heard, to be a part of the process, and to be able to somehow have an incidence in whether or not the project goes forward. In the future, when these consultation processes, which are inherently flawed, they may fail or they may succeed, but still not represent accurately what the communities are demanding. In the future, then these demands might change. But for now, it is all focused on the fact that several mining projects are going through these consultations, and these consultations in the past and in the present have not been done adequately.
So essentially, they just want a say in the business projects that the state delivers into their own land, basically.
Not exactly, because basically a lot of people, they're saying we are part of the consultation process, and that gives us a right to say, no, we do not want the project. So the demand is no, and the vehicle is this consultation process.
Right. So they basically want to have their rights enforced, essentially. When they say no, it means no.
Exactly, which historically in this country has not been the case, of course. So this is just another iteration of the same conflict as always. The indigenous communities are saying, no, we do not want these things. And the government is basically either ignoring or pandering to them in such a way that they want to make them feel heard, but not necessarily, acquiesce to their will. And that is basically the tension that is going on currently with these roadblocks and with the resistance movement.
Right. And I think for any of our listeners that don't know, when a mine, I've seen it myself. I did some work in Peru years back about they were doing like mining, gold mining in the rainforest. And when a mine like this moves in, it isn't a small operation. Firstly, the whole area is like taken over by industry. Secondly, it destroys the environment in a very serious way. And thirdly, most of the people from the area don't really get the profits, from this operation. So it's not a small thing, right? When a mine moves in, it's not like, oh, well, let's just have new jobs. Like, it's a very big issue.
That is a very good point, because one of the main problems that we have with this nickel mine is that nickel is not a precious metal. It is not a rare metal. It is actually a base metal. And it is also a base metal that is going to, in the future, become a very important part of the upcoming electric and like battery-powered new green energy movement, right? Which, if you listen to indigenous communities around the world, they're very wary of this new green energy movement, because it always, in the end, involves extraction of materials from their lands. And in the case of nickel, since it is a base material, it means the movement of absolutely enormous amounts of earth. And this nickel mine in particular is actually right next to the largest lake in the country. And this lake is actually an important source of biodiversity, very unique worldwide. Another issue that we have also with this nickel mining project is that it is actually something like 12.5 times bigger than the legal limit. So the actual area that is conceded to the mining company is 220, I believe, 4 kilometers squared, which is just absolutely huge. It's bigger than our capital city.
Mm.
Yeah, and this is area that they just have the right to tear up as they please over the course of the next 50 years. So yeah, and they're basically, the way that they managed to get the mine to be bigger than the legal limit is that they very, very simply justified it by saying, yeah, listen, nickel, it doesn't give a lot of money compared to other minerals, so we need to be able to tear up more land. And they sent a letter to the ministry that were approved, and life moved on.
Jesus Christ. This is the problem, right? So if you look at, for example, let's say like Tesla, right? I've been reading into this because, personally, I very much believe in saving the environments, rewilding, that kind of thing, but not the way it's going. So if you look at the way it's going with Tesla, for example, right? So, okay, electric cars, that's great for emissions, which, yeah, that is great if, you're in California or London or wherever and you're driving your nice fucking electric car. But nickel is one of the key mineral ingredients of the lithium ion batteries that they use in that electric car. So where do they get that nickel from? Well, now we're seeing it, like indigenous communities having their whole fucking place uprooted so that, people in the West can feel a little bit better about driving their car around. To me, it just seems incredibly kind of backwards and actually corrupt in a way. But what I'm thinking is, who are these Russian businesses that you were just talking about that are buying and selling this nickel after it's extracted? What do we know about them?
Well, we know very little about them, and that's actually part of the problem.
Right.
So these nickel companies came in, like I said, around 2010, and actually the company will deny that they are a Russian company. In fact, the coordinator for my organization actually went on to local news to discuss this subject, and they invited the PR person for the company on that day, and they said, "No, we're not a Russian company." And the news anchor actually said, "But aren't all of your owners literally Russian people?" And he's like, "Yeah, but we're not a Russian company." So it's very sketchy. We're not exactly sure where the money traces to yet and who actually owns the company, but they are linked to a Swiss company called Solway Investment Group, which Solway Investment Group is basically just one of these big anonymous corporations that in the end are owned by Russians. And so we actually have copies of these people's passports because they have to turn them in as part of the requests for the mining project. And we also have their names registered in our national business registry. And essentially, all of the owners of the companies are Russians. And in fact, if you go on and you look at other large mining interests that are starting to develop in the country, you will find that there are a series of companies that were founded by geologists who do exploration and then prepare the requests and get the administrative process moving, and then basically sell the company to new interests. And essentially, there have been at least 4 of these companies that we have counted that were prepared by actually the same geologist team and then sold to the exact same Russians. The same names are actually in the ownership documents for these different companies.
So it's not exactly they've not exactly hidden that very well. You know what I mean?
No, they're not even trying, because
Right.
in a country like Guatemala, you do not have to.
So what's been the government's response to this recent situation then? Have they kind of reached out to the indigenous community? I mean, politically, rather than sending in the cops to blast everybody with tear gas. Where are the government standing at this point?
Essentially, the government has historically in this country been basically the force arm of these companies. And so the government has not at all apologized or said it's a bad thing. They're basically maintaining a very hard hand, strong-headed, maintain the peace narrative. And essentially that is what happened, right? They basically saying, no, these people are violating this company's right to operate, which is also a very common narrative tactic that is used by the right wing in this country, is to say, oh, if you're blocking the roads, you're violating people's right to locomotion and companies' rights to operate. And it is very common to call local indigenous resistance movements terrorists. And
Right.
and actually use the classic these are commies, these red commies are here
Yeah.
to destroy our capitalist nation. People that are still stuck in the first half of the Cold War.
Yeah.
So this is basically mostly what has happened. And in fact, there have been other things. For example, when the police raided the local journalist's home, and there are pictures of where they tore his house to shit, and they took all of his recording equipment, and they briefly arrested him in front of his family. And there is actually witnesses to that, because that's what they did. And when the Prensa Comunitaria, the local journalist outlet, published a denouncement of what this happened, the police actually published a tweet where they took Prensa Comunitaria's tweet and stamped the words false in red across it and said, "This is a lie, none of this happened." And it very clearly did, and evidence of it surfaced later. So the government is basically unapologetic and in denial that any wrongdoing has been carried out.
So it sounds like it's kind of a bit of a kind of a stalemate at the moment, would you say?
I would say that in terms of the general overarching situation where people are dealing with the status of these nickel mines and whatnot, and the gold and silver mines in the rest of the country, in that sense, I would say that things are progressing very slowly, and we are still waiting to see what is happening. There are a lot of illegal operations around the country and so on. But in terms of this actual conflict, I would say the mine has managed to get its material in and has managed to continue operating. And everybody that was in some way related to this particular resistance and roadblock has either been harassed, had their house searched, or in some way been arrested. There are pictures of all the arrests. I believe something like more than 100 arrest warrants were carried out in that 3-day period that they're allowed to operate without congressional approval. And essentially what that means is that, at least for now, in the short time, the nickel company seems to have gotten the upper hand. But that is, let's say, that is the state of things here. The company always gets the upper hand, but we live to fight another day, so to speak. And so that is basically the state of things now.
Well, what does that mean then? I mean, I know obviously you don't mean like violently fight, but I mean, what does that mean for the community, the indigenous people? Like, what are they actually going to do now? Like, have you any idea? Because, like you said, it's like the machine has kind of kept working and has stopped them essentially. What are they going to do now?
Well, there are certain things. You said earlier, they're not even trying to hide it. I believe that the government operates under that philosophy as well. They do not really try to hide the things that they do. And in a way that is foolish, because in many situations around the country where resistance movements have been attacked and criminalized, the government and the police do such a shoddy job of covering up their illegal wrongdoings that eventually, after, of course, copious legal battles, these cases fall apart. And they sometimes, in very brief cases, manage to become international cases or become local cases where there is some victory for the local communities. So that is one thing. The government and the companies generally are very mediocre and shoddy about OPSEC, very mediocre and shoddy about how they actually go about doing these things. It's very flagrant. And that is a good thing for the communities, because it means that they have stuff that they can use to bring together more resistance and to manage legal battles that they could actually win. So yes, that is one side of it. But in the end, these communities, as long as they can, they will keep fighting. And we have seen that throughout the country. And that means if they need to set up a roadblock, eventually, again, they will. And if it is not a roadblock, there will at least be a camp. But there will always be somebody keeping an eye out and trying to keep this fight alive.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's a lot more militant, but a similar kind of thing is happening in the south of Chile with the Mapuche people, I think it is. It's a logging situation, but it kind of started the same way, like, roadblocks, and then eventually that didn't work. And then unfortunately now, like, it's kind of a full on, there's a militant group down there, and the government, again, like they've done in Guatemala, they declared a kind of state of emergency type thing. My worry is that perhaps in this situation in Guatemala, I mean, do you think the indigenous people are perhaps at risk of violence? Because that, I mean, when I covered this situation in Peru, right, it was people in the rainforest that lived there that didn't want people moving into their land and doing like illegal gold mining. And one of the guys that I interviewed who was trying to resist it, like a year later, he was killed by these, very clearly who'd killed them. You know what I'm saying? There was no one else around there but this mining community. And then other indigenous people and, various others were getting killed in that area because they were causing too much problems, if you like, for these mining companies. These weren't Russians, they were Chinese mining companies at the time. But anyway, my point is, it's kind of, there's a similar template to these situations, especially in these regions. I mean, do you think they're worried that, they might become more of a more, violent target for the government and these companies, because there's a lot of money here to be made, and what, people do bad things for money.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I would say that, like I said, this needs to be viewed in the context of the way that this country has operated for the past century. Indigenous communities that have been defending their land rights, defending their natural resources, and so on, have essentially been the target of violent extremism and violence in general, period. So, like, for example, if you look at some of the gold and silver mines that are basically around the corner there, people have been murdered by security guards that are currently on the lam. They're
Right.
being looked for by Interpol because they murdered people for trying to, block these mining companies. So I would say that the worry might not be so much that they are now more of a target. They always have been a target. And so operational security is always a prime concern for any of these movements and the way that they are operating. But it also means that since now that they are more in the public eye, more of their faces have been photographed, more of them have been seen. Yes, there is a worry related to that. But I would say when it comes to escalation of violence, I do not know if you could escalate the violence anymore without outright going to war.
Right, yeah, well, let's hope that doesn't happen. Okay, mate, is there anything else you think we should cover with this situation?
Yeah, well, I'd say, like I said, this is not an isolated incident, and there are many legal and illegal mining companies that are activating now throughout the country. Canadians, Americans, Russians, nobody is innocent.
Yeah.
And the group that I work for, OIE, our job is basically to keep the horn blowing about these companies, and we constantly publish more and more information about how these companies operate illegally. But in the end, basically, Guatemalan's extractive industry is ramping up. And I would say that is in some way related to the need for the new green energy industry to evolve and grow. And so this is not going to stop now. It's not going to stop anytime soon. And you have to keep your eyes and ears open because, you blink and someone else is trying to dig a hole in your backyard.
Yeah, no, it's a bad situation. Okay, mate. Well, what's some kind of how can people stay ahead of this and keep their mind on it, find out more about it? What's the best way?
Okay, well, I would point you to when it comes to local journalism in Guatemala, which will always have, I believe, the first most direct and most honest view of what is going on in the ground. I would always recommend Prensa Comunitaria. They can be found at Prensa Comunitaria on Twitter. I'll make sure you get a link for that. There is also a very good investigative journalism outlet called El Observador, which I can also give you a link to. They are basically investigative journalists that have managed to trace the history of the influence of the Russian nickel miners in Guatemala, basically for the past 6 or 7 governments. And of course, my organization called OIE, that's at OIE_GT. We put out weekly tweets on how things are going in the different mining companies and the different things we discovered through government information and open source investigation. And we also have a webpage, which is oiegt.org, where you can follow mining projects all over Guatemala and a few in Central America. We have articles, we have research that we have done, and you can also download any government information we have acquired for free on our webpage.
Okay, mate. Well, I'll make sure. Normally, I don't bother. I just get people to spell it out. But if you send me those links on Twitter, I'll make sure that everything is kind of in the description of this episode. If people want to follow you and your work, where can they do that?
My work you can follow basically through OIE. I work directly for them, and everything I put out is up on that.
All right, mate. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for the time. Cheers.
That was Benjamin Chang speaking about the situation in Guatemala, where the indigenous peoples are basically being fucked over for the minerals in their land by the state, by various foreign businesses. It's a nasty situation. I will put the links in the description of this episode that Ben mentioned at the end there if you want to find out more. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front and you want more and you want to support us, remember we cannot make any money from our documentaries because YouTube demonetized our whole channel because, I don't know, they don't like real life. We can't make any money via Instagram because they don't allow us to do any of that. So the way we make money is via Patreon. We sell extra content on Patreon, bonus episodes, narrated articles. There's a whole series on there instructing people on how to be a reporter if they want to be. There's a community Discord, loads of stuff. So go to patreon.com/popularfront. Without the patrons, we don't grow. So yeah, patreon.com/popularfront. Or if you want to do it with crypto, Bitcoin, Ethereum, go to popularfront.co/support and you will find our wallets there. This episode was sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 South West Bond Avenue, 97239. Tell them Popular Front sent you. The episode was also sponsored by our friends at Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA, one in South, one in West. Find them on socials at Grindcore House. The episode was also sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world, by prints at propagandopolis.com. Use the promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. If you want to follow us on social media, Instagram at popular.front. Might as well follow the backup as well because we're constantly being censored and they're threatening to take us down all the time on there. So the backup is at popularfront_. Twitter at popularfront_. YouTube.com/popularfront to see all our documentaries, or just go to popularfront.tv. Website popularfront.co. You'll find links to everything there. If you want to follow me on social media, it's at Jake_Hanrahan. HANRAHAN is how you spell my surname. You'll find my work at jakehanrahan.com. Thank you very much to the following high tier Patreons. They are RA, Champagne Anarchist, Thwat, I don't know if that's meant to say twat, I'm not sure. Thwat, Elisa Middlefar, Jess, Lewis or Louis, David McManus, Joaquin Williamson Holt, Yudoye Travis, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Kate, Lisa Milgram, Bradley Davies, Brendan Crave, Pete Hesher, RX, A. Nicole, Travis Lieberman, Cherry, Ben Marshall, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle, MJ, K Glitter Vulcan, Meredith Waters, Bethany Swoveland, Adam H, Karante, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamond Steen, Michael O'Connor, Zach Packard, Todd Cravens, Nicholas Butter, Ron Swanson, JD, Jav, Ian Froese, James Cully, Tynan Daly, Ethan, Fitz Madrid, Ed Coulthard, Mike Barone, Ben, Liam Williams, Chris Cusimano, Degenerate Zero Alpha, Giorgio Arani, DR, Trey Nance, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Nawaiz, Nate Van Dor, Christina Rivetti, Freya Northman, Ali Hunter, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, Adam Bergsnyder, JL, Anthony Kubarak, Dan Dunham, Fletcher, Chad Walker, Diana Gorvanek, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick, Axel Iverson, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Maurice Zumbul. Thank you all very much. Really do appreciate it. You keep this going. If you want to support us, patreon.com/popularfront. Oh shit, I forgot. Music in this episode, the intro is by Home and the outro is by Sam Black. Listen to his music at samblackpf.com.